Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Blaise Mishtal, Vice President for Policy at GINSA. This afternoon, we're releasing our newest report entitled Flight Risk, Turkey and the F-35. You can find it at our website at ginsa.org. And I'm pleased to be joined by two of the authors and two of our esteemed Turkey experts that we have here at GINSA to discuss the report. Ambassador Eric Edelman, distinguished scholar at GINSA, former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, as well as Dr. Svante Cornell, a scholar here at GINSA, a longtime studier of Turkey as well. Thank you both for being with us. Svante, maybe I could start with you to give us a bit of the history and explanation of why this topic of the F-35 is coming up again. Turkey was in the U.S. F-35 program. It was going to get F-35s, then it got kicked out. Now it's asking to get back in. Can you give us a little more of the background and the context, please?
Well, sure, Blaise. Obviously, I would defer to Ambassador Edelman, who has been in the midst of many of these developments much more than I have. But the short version is that Turkey, of course, I think it's important to note, has a defense industry that has been growing very rapidly. I remember back when I lived in Turkey myself in the late 1990s, quickly after the military had done its intervention in 1997 into politics, declared a major modernization program of the Turkish military at I seem to remember, to the range of $150 billion over whatever number of years. So this has been a long time in the making, the building of a Turkish defense industry, which in turn, by the way, is very much connected to the fact that Turkey has been dependent on Western suppliers, particularly the United States. And as Ambassador Edelman would know, the Turks have been worried about the fact that at times in the relationship, you can go back all the way to 1974 and the crisis over Cyprus, or 1980 and the military coup, the US restricted supplies to Turkey in spite of the country's role as a very crucial NATO ally. Obviously, this is something that has led the Turks to develop their own defense industry. The interesting twist to this, of course, is that if you look at where Turkish defense industry is oriented, if you will, or who they cooperate with, it's very largely with the large Western defense concerns, whether they be defense corporations, whether they be American, German, or other European. Obviously, they do have some partnerships with others, but really they are very heavily integrated into the Western military industrial system, if you like. And that made it kind of natural for Turkey to be part of the F-35 program as that was developing. Obviously, everything was fine up until the moment where Turkey had a military coup in 2016, a failed military coup that, for a long list of reasons that maybe we should go into or should not, it's up to you, Blaise, the Turks suspected some type of American involvement, whether it be direct involvement or at least that they were aware of this coup that they suspected, with good reason, to have been masterminded by a exiled preacher, Islamic preacher, who was a former bedfellow of Erdogan's by the name of Fethullah Gulen, who had spent 40 years populating the Turkish state institutions with his followers and supporters. Obviously, the Middle East, Turkey included, is a very conspiratorial environment. And the fact that you have an Islamic preacher who is based in the United States, in the Poconos in Pennsylvania, couldn't happen, according to a lot of people in that part of the world, unless there had been some form of nefarious involvement by the American intelligence agencies. And if you've lived long enough in that part of the world, you would understand how a lot of people would reach that conclusion, whether or not there are any facts, to back that up. This is a long-winded type of introduction to why the Turks decided to buy the S-400 missile system. There was an estrangement between the United States and Turkey, which had been brewing over a number of issues, not just over the Fethullah Gulen issue and the military coup and whatever suspicions about that, but also about Turkish policies, and particularly, American policies in Syria, where the US had been supporting and keeps supporting ethnic Kurdish groupings that are connected to a organization, the PKK, that that the United States itself classifies as a terrorist organization, which obviously leads to concerns in Turkey about what really is the intention behind this American policy. The fact that the US didn't really have any good options in terms of fighting ISIS at the time is not exactly something that Turks usually want to listen to. They draw their own conclusions. Again, there is this widespread idea in Turkey, whether you talk about secularist people who are anti-Erdogan or Erdogan supporters, that somehow the Americans have it out for Turkey. The Americans are trying to split Turkey up. They're trying to create a Kurdish state and so on and so forth. And against this background, and particularly the fact that the Erdogan and his supporters couldn't trust didn't trust a lot of people within their own military, I think contributed significantly to the decision to purchase the S-400 system, in spite of American warnings that this would be incompatible with the F-35 system. And after that, obviously, after the Turkish purchase of this air defense system, which has never been deployed and is resting in crates or boxes somewhere, the US imposed sanctions that are very clear about this system not being, shouldn't be on Turkish soil for the United States to be able to allow Turkey to re-enter the F-35 program. Obviously, in recent times, President Trump, as we know, has a very good personal relationship with President Erdogan. They've had phone conversations that were very positive, and Trump has repeatedly publicly praised Erdogan as a strong leader and a friend. And I think this obviously makes the Turks seeing an opportunity to be brought back into that program. I think that's probably enough of an introduction. I'll just note that in spite of all the discussions, of Turkish foreign policy that we'll get into, I suspect very shortly, it is interesting that the inclusion in this program is so important to Turkey, that they want to be part, they want to be brought into the program because they know there is nothing like it. They're trying to develop their own aircraft. They could buy planes from the Chinese or the Russians, but they know that there is nothing comparable to what the United States is able to produce. And I think that's an important part of our discussion.
Thanks, Fanti. Ambassador Edelman, let me turn to you, I guess maybe for a double header, two questions. One, can you talk about sort of the F-35 program? Because when we're talking about Turkey and the F-35, we're not just talking about them flying the plane or having the plane. We're talking about being part of the F-35 program. So what did that entail when Turkey was part of it? What would it entail? But also a little more, I guess, on why the S-400 was such a big deal that it led to them getting kicked out. Why was it such a problematic decision on their part that we couldn't then allow the S-400 and the F-35 to both be present in Turkey?
Right. So Turkey was, I believe, a tier 2 partner in the F-35 program. They were one of the original partners, and what that meant was not only that they were going to purchase F-35 aircraft once the aircraft was built. I mean, this goes back to the early 2000s, their agreement to participate in this. But also, they were actually going to, produce some elements of the F-35 in Turkey, in various parts of the Turkish defense industry that Svante just was describing a moment ago. And I believe it included parts of the fuselage and some of the cockpit assembly that Turkey was going to be involved in. The decision to kick Turkey out of the F-35 program because of their purchase of S-400 has a couple of elements. First, the S-400 was really only the most recent piece of Turkey's flirtation with non-NATO air and missile defense systems. So earlier, Turkey had actually signed a letter of intent to purchase a Chinese system for missile and air defense from CMEC. And the U.S. government at that time told the government of Turkey that it would be incompatible with with the F-35, it would not be interoperable. The thing about the F-35 is uh, it is more than just an aircraft. It is really a system of systems with an enormous number of sensors that are connected to a lot of other elements of the U.S. Global and NATO's command and control systems. And if the F-35, for instance, was co-located with and operating with the S-400, there was a belief that it would potentially compromise, open up some of the things that make the F-35 particularly effective system, as Israel has just demonstrated by its use of F-35s last October in its strike against Iran, that some of those systems could be compromised uh, by Russia. So that is why the Trump administration in the first term took the very painful decision, particularly painful for Lockheed Martin, the primary contractor on the F-35, to kick Turkey out, because it meant they had to unwind part of their supply chain. They had to, reshore it elsewhere. They had to eat a lot of costs that were already kind of sunk costs in the supply chain that had been created for the F-35 as part of this broad partnership, not just with Turkey, but a number of other countries, Norway, several other NATO countries, UK, etc. And it was taken for good and sufficient reason. I would add one other piece to this. The U.S., although the Turks have sort of denied this or poo-pooed it, the U.S. made major efforts to sell Patriot to Turkey. And those efforts have actually been described in great detail by two of my former colleagues in DOD, Jim Townsend and Rachel Ellahus, who were involved in those discussions. That's been described publicly in a piece they wrote in War on the Rocks. And the Turks basically refused to really countenance the conditions, the terms and conditions that the U.S. would impose on the sale, not just for them, but for any other ally when it comes to something like Patriot.
So, Ambassador, why is Turkey interested in getting back into the program now? I guess some 6 years later. The U.S. just agreed to sell them new F-16s and upgrade some of their existing F-16s. Do they have a strategic reason for thinking that's not enough, that they need the F-35? Is there something else behind their interest in it now?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, Greece did get F-35s. That was a recent development that came long after Turkey's original inclusion as a partner in the program, but also its exclusion. But that always was a consideration, I think, in Ankara. In addition, Turkey has big ambitions to be a regional player, a regional superpower, as its former foreign minister once said. With the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, a subject I'm sure we're going to get into, they've got more airspace potentially to be patrolling from their point of view, and they've obviously seen what F-35 can do because of the recent demonstration. I think, don't get me wrong, F-16 is a great aircraft, but it's not a fifth generation aircraft, and I think the Turks want to have a modern air force with the best fifth generation aircraft available, which is the F-35, as Svante just said. I would just pick up on one more point that Svante made, which I think is important. Because I just want to draw it out a little bit. I think that the coup and the purchase of the S-400s was in many people's minds, a deliberate decision by Erdogan, because when the coup took place, arguably the sort of center of gravity militarily of the coup was the Turkish Air Force. I think Erdogan actually was hoping to procure and the Turkish Air Force actually bombed the Turkish Grand National Assembly in the course of the coup. And I believe that Erdogan was hoping with this purchase, among other things, to have something that could shoot down F-16s if there was going to be another coup attempt, and the Air Force was going to use its own inventory of aircraft against the government. And that led him, I think, in part, I think erroneously, because I think it's not, not necessarily the case that you couldn't shoot down, a U.S. aircraft with Patriot. But I think that was part of his calculation. I defer to Svante on that.
So does that mean if he's now looking for the F-35 that he's no longer concerned with possible coups, that he thinks he has the military well enough in hand? Is that something we should read into this?
I think he is, we're 10 years, almost 10 years on now from the coup. I think he's more comfortable. He's had 10 years since the coup to basically ensure that the current crop of senior officers is loyal to him and to the current regime.
Svante, if the S-400 has been such a sticking point between the U.S. and Turkey and sort of got Turkey kicked out of the F-35 program in the first place, has Turkey made any suggestion that it's willing to give up on the S-400 or compromise on it in exchange for getting the F-35?
I would say that the answer is yes and no. I mean, it's yes in a way that, Turkey has not deployed this system, the S-400 system. I think it's important to remember they purchased this for, I don't remember the amount, but we're talking a lot of money that they spent for the system, and it's still resting in crates in some warehouse somewhere in Turkey. I think what I gather is that the Turks didn't really take the American ultimatum, if you like, seriously. They thought that the US would somehow ignore or go back on its own word in terms of what the purchase of the S-400 would mean, and that essentially the Americans were bluffing. And they found out the Americans were not bluffing, and they're stuck in a situation where they've purchased the system. We have to remember that Turkey is trying to, if you will, or let me put it this way, Turkish foreign policy nowadays is governed by the idea that we have to be an independent pole that has transactional relationships with all major powers. Obviously, they have a treaty relationship with the United States and only with the United States, but they have deep relations with others, including Russia. And as we've seen after the war in Ukraine, or the Russian second invasion of Ukraine, Turkey has been very supportive of Ukraine, but not at the expense of their relations with Russia. They think they can, and they've shown that they can act against Russian interests, whether it be in Ukraine or in Syria or in Libya or in the Caucasus, and have the Russians basically tolerate or accept this. So that's an important relationship for the Turks. So we have to understand that from the Turkish perspective, doing a full 180, first of all, would lose face. I think that's probably the most important part for a government that, or and a regime under Erdogan that shows itself very much to be independent, a regional leader, an international power that nobody can bully. Obviously, once the United States has imposed sanctions, the only thing you can do is, you can backtrack. But backtracking is costly in terms of your international standing and your domestic standing. And it's also costly with in terms of the relationship with Russia, obviously. So I think these are probably some of the reasons, I think, why Turkey didn't do a full 180 and realize that, okay, we made a mistake, let's make up and be friends again. Things are a little bit more complicated where we stand. We're also in a situation where domestically in Turkey, thanks, by the way, a lot to Erdogan's own statements and own propaganda, we have a very anti-American electorate. So in a way, you have created a beast, right? If you are at the helm of the Turkish state and you've painted up, especially in the past 10 years or more since the start of the Syrian civil war and the Kurdish issue, over there the Americans as an enemy of the state. It feeds, somehow you have to feed the beast, and then just completely turning around on that would be costly, I think, for both within the elite politics and within popular support at large, which still matters in Turkey. As we've seen, Turkey is becoming more authoritarian, but I think that's partly as a result of the weakness of the state and the weakness of the regime. And I think they're acutely aware of the necessity, if you will, to feed the nationalist beast that they've created.
So, Ambassador Edelman, maybe we'll cut to the chase, and I'll ask you, with the S-400 still present in Turkey, not deployed, but maybe Turkey not being willing to get rid of it, should the United States be willing to let Turkey back into the F-35? What's the recommendation in the paper you've just released?
Well, let me just stress that I think this is actually, one of these close calls in government, the 51-49 call. I mean, in the best of all worlds, one would hope that because of Turkey's importance, its geographical location, the size of its military, and therefore its potential contribution to the alliance, the fact that it has been supportive of Ukraine, in the best of all possible worlds, we'd want to have a strong partnership with Turkey, and you might be able, under those circumstances, to make an argument for letting them back in. Unfortunately, we're not operating with Turkey in the best of all possible worlds. Turkey has been at odds with the United States repeatedly, as Svante talked about in some of his comments, but moreover, they've been obstreperous and difficult inside NATO, obstructing, for instance, for almost 2 years, the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Although right now we're in a period of relative calm between Turkey and Greece. It was not that long ago that Turkey was making enormous threats against Greece, with the President Erdogan, talking about coming in like a thief in the night into Greece to invade. There have been continued skirmishes. Luckily, no one's actually fired at anybody, but we continue to see the sort of aerial dogfighting over the Aegean from time to time. And most recently, we've seen potential for conflict between Israel and Turkey in Syria, as Syria tries to stabilize, and as Turkey takes advantage of its relatively strong position there because of the role it played as a sponsor of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the former jihadist organization that allegedly has gone straight, and which is now in charge of Syria in the aftermath of the collapse of the Assad regime. So there's been lots, that has gone wrong in the U.S.-Turkish relationship. I think sufficiently, bad behavior, hosting Hamas, threatening Israel. I mean, I could add to the list. It goes on and on. To move forward with the F-35 sale now would essentially, I think, be read properly in Turkey as giving them a pass for everything that that has transpired in the relationship. So I think my own preference at this point would not to be to transfer F-35. That's what we argue in the paper. However, because the administration has shown some openness, just the other week when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in the Oval Office, President Trump, made a point of telling the Prime Minister that he's a good friend of Erdogan's and he could help Israel with Erdogan. Whether that's true or not remains to be seen. If it were true, that would be potentially a good thing. We'll see. But if the administration were to move forward, it would have to overcome some both, I would say, obstacles in policy, but also in law, because there are requirements on the books before Turkey can get back into the F-35 program that Congress policies imposed, including getting rid of the offending S-400 system.
Yeah, so maybe we could expound on that just a little bit. Could President Trump sort of unilaterally let Turkey back into the F-35 program, or without getting rid of the S-400, I guess, or what are the requirements that Turkey would have to meet in order for that to happen?
Well, I mean, the law says that Turkey would have to find a solution to either sell the S-400, transfer it to somebody else, return it, which the Russians have said they're not going to, no backsies, so they're not going to take it back. I mean, there are.
But the current situation of having it boxed up but inside Turkey doesn't meet the legal requirements?
Not as I read them. I mean, there are potential creative solutions. We ran into this with the S-300 on Cyprus. Those S-300s were crated up and now reside in Crete. That was in the late 1990s and was a creative solution. So there are potential creative solutions. We've raised some of them, potentially a waiver from the United States and a transfer to India, which has a long tradition of reliance on Russian military equipment, has shown interest in buying the S-400. There are a variety of different potential solutions. Turkey, to the best of my knowledge, has shown interest in none of them.
Swansea, curious to get your take on this close 51-49 decision on whether to sell the F-35 or not.
No, it's a very difficult question because I mean, from a broader perspective, the argument why we would even consider making that type of decision would be based on the broader, geopolitical competition that the United States finds itself in, with a strengthening, if you will, at least on the surface level, alliance between the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and as we know, the North Koreans, who are sending troops all the way to the Ukrainian border. In this broader geopolitical confrontation, you have a couple of regional powers that are, if you will, on the fence, or that are nominally part or interlinked with the West, but are at the same time playing a little bit with the other side, if you will. India is a perfect example of this, and so is Turkey. So in the longer term, what would we prefer? Would we prefer a Turkey that says, okay, it's not going to work with the West and the United States. We don't like them anyway. They don't like us. Let's just make common cause with the other side. Not that I necessarily think this is something that is in the Turkish interest, mind you, but this is something we have to keep in mind. Whereas obviously the preferred scenario for us is a Turkey that remains anchored in the West, and if you will, is brought back in whether it's under Erdogan or more likely in a post-Erdogan situation, a Turkey that is brought back into a more, should I say, normal relationship with the United States and NATO. And to me, the important question is, well, what is the policy that advances that goal, not perhaps in the near term where it might not be realistic, but in the middle term, in the medium term. And there, I think, again, it's a 51-49, and it's a question of yes, but, or no, if you will. And it seems to me that the positive news, if you will, is that the Turks remain so deeply entrenched within the Western military-industrial cooperation system. They understand the value of it, and that in itself is leverage. The fact that they want to be brought into the F-35 is leverage from the perspective of the United States. And the question is, how do we use this leverage? And to me, it's a matter of what are our priorities? How do we rank the priorities that we want to achieve in terms of influencing Turkish foreign policy? And I'll preface that by saying that I think over the long term, we will have to renegotiate the ground rules, if you will, of the relationship between Turkey and the United States in a world where, we're still functioning, and much of the relationship is still on paper functioning in a similar way as it was during the Cold War, where really, the United States was a lot stronger, Turkey was a lot weaker, and there was a situation of dependency. To some extent, there is still a situation of dependency. On the other hand, I think even in a longer term, if you don't have Erdogan in power, you have a totally different type of government in Turkey. The days where we could count on Turkey being quote unquote loyal to the United States, those days are gone. We're going to have to build new ground rules where perhaps a more equal relationship, but that relationship has to be based on trust. And that trust just isn't there right now for very good reason. And Ambassador Edelman pointed to some of them. We can talk about Turkey's support for Islamist organizations, whether from the Muslim Brotherhood to Hamas to more violent groups in the Syrian context and elsewhere. Ambassador Edelman talked about the whole Eastern Mediterranean situation that flared up a few years ago and seems to have calmed down a bit. Relationships within NATO with Greece are nothing new. That's always been the case. But it seems to me that what is really the most egregious matter is the Turkish rhetoric on Israel. The Turkish rhetoric on essentially immediately after the October 7 attacks on Israel, which showed very little understanding for, if you will, the Israeli situation, and in a way came back to a full-throated kind of Islamist knee-jerk support for Hamas and its atrocities. And that's just not acceptable. I think we can talk about a lot of the other issues that are problematic in terms of Cyprus, in terms of the Aegean Sea, in terms of Greece, in terms of Turkey's relations with Russia and many other things. But to me, it really boils down to the Turkish approach to Israel, and that becomes very, very relevant and very direct, as Ambassador Edelman pointed out, over the Syrian issue and the Syrian airspace. And that's where the F-35 is going to be very relevant. So in that sense, I'm not sure what are exactly the criteria that would make Turkey, that would make us be able to trust Turkish intentions regarding its relationship with Israel, but something very serious has to change in terms of how Turkey approaches Israel. Now, the Turks, I think it's fair to say, if you look at Turkish foreign policy over the past few years, even on the issue of Israel and Gaza, there is a clear difference between what Erdogan is saying and what Turkey as a country and as a state is doing. That's true in terms of the trade issues. That's true in terms of the threats that are being made, where on the one hand you have threats being made, on the other hand we know that there is intelligence discussions frequently between Turks and Israelis. So, I mean, we should not make the mistake of thinking Turkey is another Iran. That's not what we're dealing with here. But again, bringing Turkey back into the F-35 program and hoping that that's just a carrot that's going to make the Turks behave differently, I think is not realistic. We're going to have to see some type of very serious and very public change in the way Turkey is behaving, not only primarily in the Turkish rhetoric, I should say, but also in terms of Turkish behavior vis-a-vis Israel and the Israel-Gaza conflict before we can make any such determination.
To that point, Sponti, the paper suggests that if President Trump does decide to go ahead with letting Turkey back into the F-35 program, there should be some conditions on doing so. Can you talk a little bit about what we recommend those are if the U.S. does decide to go ahead?
Oh, sure. I mean, the most obvious issue is that the legal issues related to the F-35 have to be to the S-400s, I'm sorry, have to be resolved. There's no way around it. The Turks are trying to think that the United States is going to budge. I think it's important for them to understand that that's not going to happen. There has to be some type of solution. It can be a creative solution, as Ambassador Edelman said about the F-35s, about the S-400s, but they have to be somehow dealt with in such a way that they can't just be uncrated, unboxed, and put into use in Turkey. That's number one. The second issue has to do with Turkey and its relationship with Hamas, obviously. There can be no situation in which Turkey is welcoming Hamas leadership in Turkey and we are supplying Turkey with F-35s. I don't think that makes sense. The third is the deconfliction in Syria. And I think that's frankly something I think both the Turks and the Israelis are interested in. I don't think either party is interested in a major conflagration over Syria. And I think the United States can play a very significant role in setting up a system through which Turkey and Israel can deconflict over Syria, where the respective interests of the two countries are respected. And ideally, I would think that the Syria issue, which is right now a threat to the Turkish-Israeli relationship, obviously, can also be turned into something positive, an area where Turkey and Israel, because they both need to be in Syria and they both realize that they need to deal with each other in Syria, where they can start to rebuild their relationship, at least initially, in a less public way, but probably, hopefully, in the future, in a more sustainable and public way.
Thanks. One more question for you, Ambassador Edelman, and then happy to open it up to questions from the audience. If you do have a question you want to pose to the panelists, you can submit it using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and then I'll be happy to read it out. But Ambassador Edelman, another recommendation that the paper has is sort of holds regardless of whether the U.S. lets Turkey back into the F-35 program or not, and it has to do potentially with reviewing or rethinking how we think about selling U.S. weapons to Turkey. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Well, in U.S. law, we've had for some time a requirement to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge vis-a-vis its neighbors. And so that's always been a factor in U.S. arms sales in the Middle East region. But Turkey, of course, sits sort of right on a dividing line between both dividing lines in the unified command plan of the Department of Defense between EUCOM and CENTCOM, and between regional bureaus of the Department of State, between the Near Eastern Bureau and the European Bureau. And we've never really applied QME considerations before to Turkey. But I fear that in the current moment, both because of the kind of intemperate rhetoric that not just President Erdogan, but his son and other senior officials in the cabinet have used against Israel, and because, as Svante was just saying, we've got a situation where you've got both countries' aircraft flying over Syria. Both have interests in Syria that they're understandably trying to protect, but also, I think, as Svante said, both sides want to avoid a conflict. We not only need to deconflict, but I think we need to make sure that we don't have U.S. military equipment that ends up being used against Israel. That would be, I think, not just against Israel's interests, but against ours.
Maybe one more question while we wait to see if there's any questions from the audience. Maybe I play devil's advocate a little bit, Ambassador and Svante, but if the concern is that the U.S. and Turkey are increasingly going sort of their different ways on foreign policy, wouldn't rejecting this Turkish request for the F-35 sort of just push Turkey further away and exacerbate the problems we've been having with them for the last decade, if not more? Is there a way to hedge against that if we do turn down the request?
Well, I would say that first, there's risk in any foreign policy that you undertake, and there's certainly some risk that we would push Turkey further away. My own view is that for a lot of reasons, as Svante has suggested, Turkey remains very much, at least its defense industry, remains very much tied up to Western defense industry. I think the F-35 still remains by far the best aircraft on offer. And of course, if they were to purchase a fifth generation aircraft from China or from Russia. That would only exacerbate problems that they have, not just with us, but with other NATO allies. So I think there are ways to keep this in bounds. And the best way to do that, honestly, is, in my view, quiet but frank diplomacy with Turkey. Best not, in my view, best not conducted from an armchair in the Oval Office, but through the use of actual, diplomats on the ground. Tom Barrack was just confirmed yesterday by the United States Senate to be the next U.S. ambassador at Turkey. He has the president's full confidence, and I would suspect that this ought to be, the highest item on his agenda, in my view.
Fonzie, anything to add on that before we close out?
Yeah, I would. I think to put it simply, for a very long time, we have not had a strategy towards Turkey, a long-term political strategy of where Turkey fits in the broader U.S. national security interests. And that's not only an American problem, you see this elsewhere. And the reality is that Turkey is a difficult country to deal with, not only because of the nature of its regime. And, you could, throughout the close to 45 minutes we've had here, somebody could have made a 45-minute presentation that would have convinced most everybody why Turkey absolutely never should be included in the F-35 or anything like it again because of its behavior. And somebody else could make an almost equally convincing story about why, or presentation about why Turkey absolutely has to be included and is crucial for the US interest going forward. That's just the nature of the beast that we're dealing with here, because of the very contradictory nature of Turkey, which sometimes is difficult for people who have, worked on Turkey for decades to really make sense of. The country rests between, the ways in between geographical boundaries of the US government. It's traditionally been treated as a part of Europe. As Ambassador Edelman noted, we have this problem that Turkey, in terms of the military, is part of the European Command. But as soon as we started dealing with problems that are part of CENTCOM, those relationships didn't exist, and that was a very strong contributing factor to the problems between the US and Turkey at the time, especially during the Iraq War. But Turkey falls in between, our geographical boundaries. It's not a country that fits easily into preconceived notions about either a Middle Eastern or European or an Asian or any other type of country. So it is always going to be a difficult country to deal with. The point I'm trying to make is, any decision we take regarding the F-35 can only be successful if it's a part of a long-term policy and a long-term strategy. Unfortunately, the risk is that, given the circumstances of our current politics, this will be a decision that will be taken with a very short-term transactional approach. That could go, if we're lucky, that could work wonderfully. If we're unlucky, it could go very wrong, because people on the other side will read it very differently from whatever the intentions were. But over the long term, I think it's incumbent upon the US government, but also organizations like JINSA and others, to help the United States develop a long-term approach to how we deal with Turkey, how we see Turkey in terms of broader US interests, whether it be in Europe, Black Sea, Russia, Central Asia, Middle East, and beyond. And we just don't have that. And that's why I'm afraid, whether we say yes or no to the F-35s, we're going to be back with a similar type of situation, whether in 6 months or a year or two, because we just don't put Turkey into a broader strategic context the way we really need to do.
So, Ambassador Edelman, final question. When do we think there might be some news on the F-35, or what are we looking for next in the U.S.-Turkey relationship? There's been suggestions that Erdogan might be coming to Washington. Do we know if that's happening?
We've all, I think, seen the same reports. I've seen no confirmation of a date for a Trump-Erdogan meeting, but I do agree with the premise of your question, Blaise, which is that's going to be the next big, opportunity for something to happen. I suspect, Ambassador Barak will be going out shortly to Ankara, and that issue, among others, will be something he takes up pretty quickly. But until there's some forcing function, I don't know that we're going to see any developments, on this either way. I would note that one thing I don't think we have noted in this discussion is Turkey and Israel are already engaged in discussions about deconfliction over Syria, because both of them realize how, I think, potentially wrong this could go if not managed carefully. My own view is that an active U.S. role would be very helpful here. I don't think we should get in the way of anything that they're doing, but I suspect that U.S. good offices and also technical assistance could be extremely helpful in keeping the two sides from an accident or miscalculation or some other incident that leads to escalation over Syria.
Well, if and when Presidents Trump and Erdogan do meet, or there's further developments on the F-35 front, or God forbid there are any incidents between Turkey and Israel, I'm sure we'll be back to discuss those. In the meantime, Ambassador Edelman Svanti, thank you for joining us. To the audience, thanks for tuning in. Please check out our new paper, Flight Risk, Turkey and the F-35, which you can find on jinsa.org. And thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.